In the dim glow of a flickering overhead light, the small apartment exuded an air of quiet despair. The cramped living space bore silent testimony to the turbulence within its walls. Shards of broken glass were scattered across a faded, threadbare carpet, while battered furniture, once a symbol of warmth and home, now stood as mute witnesses to long-held secrets and unspoken sorrows. Rachel Carter moved slowly through the narrow space, her steps deliberate yet burdened by exhaustion. Each movement carried the weight of a history filled with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. She methodically set about her evening chores, her mind drifting between memories of gentler times and the ever-present shadow of looming dread. In contrast, David Carter paced the room with a restless, dangerous energy. His face, hardened by years of disappointment and inner turmoil, shifted from moments of pained introspection to bursts of volatile anger. Once a construction worker who had built homes with care, he now bore the scars of a life unraveling at its seams, fractured by untreated demons and the burden of a failing mind. Amid the discord, little Emma Carter played quietly on the worn carpet. At only 5 years old, her small hands busied themselves with colorful scraps of paper as she pieced together a makeshift puzzle. Her bright eyes, filled with a child's untainted wonder, observed the world around her. Yet, even in her innocence, Emma sensed that something was amiss. The usual lullabies of home had given way to a dissonance she could neither understand nor ignore. As the evening advanced, the oppressive atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier. David's irritability mounted with every passing minute, his low mutterings turning into sharp, angry exclamations. The once familiar sounds of everyday life were gradually replaced by a growing tension, as if the very walls were bracing themselves for an inevitable rupture. In the stillness of that oppressive night, every creak and every whisper seemed to foretell impending calamity. Then, without warning, the fragile calm shattered. With a guttural roar that tore through the silence, David lunged at Rachel. In one swift, brutal motion, he seized her arm and slammed her against the wall. The impact sent shockwaves through the room. Objects trembled and a vase toppled to the floor, its contents spilling like tears onto the worn rug. Rachel's eyes widened in shock and pain, her body crumpling under the violent force that had been unleashed. Her anguished cry filled the apartment, a desperate sound that reverberated through every corner of their small home. Emma, who had been silently watching from behind the safety of the sofa, felt a cold wave of terror crash over her. In that heart-stopping instant, the world as she knew it disintegrated into chaos. Though her young mind could not grasp the full gravity of the situation, a deep, instinctive fear propelled her into action. With trembling hands, she crawled toward the battered telephone lying on a rickety side table. The phone, a lifeline amid the unfolding nightmare, seemed to vibrate with a promise of help. The operator's calm voice cut through the mayhem as the receiver was lifted. 911, what's your emergency? In that moment, time appeared to slow. Emma's small fingers fumbled with the receiver as her voice, barely more than a whisper, emerged. My daddy! He's hurting Mommy! Her words, fragile yet resolute, echoed through the darkened room, carrying the weight of a child's desperate plea for salvation. Outside, the night wore on, its shadows deepening as the call of innocence pierced the darkness. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a stage for tragedy, a place where violence and vulnerability intermingled. The flickering light overhead mirrored the instability within, casting wavering shadows that danced like specters along the walls. In those moments, the delicate boundary between hope and despair blurred. The simple act of dialing for help had set in motion a series of events that would forever alter the lives of those within. Rachel, her face a canvas of pain and disbelief, could only stare in horror at the unfolding scene. The agony etched on her features spoke of years spent silently enduring torment. David's rage, unabated and consuming, now dominated the space, a dark force that threatened to engulf everything in its path. And in the center of it all, Emma's brave act of summoning help shone like a small beacon of light against the encroaching gloom, with the operator's urgent query still echoing faintly in the background. The apartment stood suspended in a fragile moment of uncertainty. The silence that followed was as profound as it was foreboding, hinting at a future where the actions of one small child might set the course for redemption or ruin. In that charged atmosphere, every second stretched out interminably, each moment laden with the possibility of both salvation and further despair. The call had been made, and the fragile spark of innocence had ignited a chain of events that no one in that battered apartment could have foreseen. In the immediate aftermath of Emma's call, the small apartment seemed to pulse with a new, ominous energy. The operator's calm voice continued to guide the frightened child through her plea, every syllable of "my daddy, he's hurting mommy," resonating with a mix of terror and desperate hope. The phone's receiver, trembling in her small hands, transmitted her message into the night, carrying it far beyond the confines of their troubled home. Outside, the city's quiet suburban streets lay cloaked in darkness, their usual serenity now punctured by the distant sound of sirens. In a modest apartment down the hall, Mary Thompson, an elderly neighbor known for her kind heart and watchful eye, had long sensed that something was amiss in the building. That night, as she sat alone with her thoughts, a faint but unmistakable murmur of distress reached her ears. Her pulse quickened as she recalled subtle clues, the hushed arguments, the stifled cries, the heavy silence that often followed the storm of anger within the Carter apartment. Unable to ignore the call of her conscience, Mary quickly retrieved her coat and stepped into the dim corridor. Her footsteps were soft yet resolute as she made her way toward the source of the disturbance. The once familiar hallway now seemed charged with an unspoken urgency, each step echoing her growing worry. As she neared the door of the Carter residence, Mary paused for a moment, gathering her courage before softly knocking, a knock that rang out sharply against the backdrop of distant chaos. Not far away, Paul Rivera, a neighbor whose weathered features bore the mark of past hardships and a vigilant nature honed during years of military service, was already on high alert. He'd long suspected that the Carter household harbored secrets too painful to speak of openly. Tonight, when the unmistakable sounds of distress permeated the building, he had wasted no time in picking up his phone. "Yes, I'm sure something's terribly wrong there," Paul said steadily into the receiver, his voice a blend of concern and authority. Every word confirmed what he feared, that the situation was spiraling beyond control. Inside the beleaguered apartment, David's fury had not abated. The mounting sounds of approaching sirens had fanned the flames of his anger, transforming his initial outburst into a relentless storm. His eyes, wild and unfocused, darted around the room in a desperate search for any semblance of control. "Stay out of this, you don't understand," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls as if to ward off the encroaching threat. Yet as the flashing red and blue lights began to dance across the interior, his control waned further with each passing moment. Rachel, still reeling from the brutal impact of David's rage, clutched at herself in silent agony. Her breaths came in short, desperate gasps as she tried to gather the shattered pieces of her resolve. The sound of the sirens, a distant promise of intervention, mingled with her inner cries for mercy. Every flash of light, every distant command over the phone was a reminder that help was coming. Even as the dark undercurrents of despair threatened to overwhelm her. Meanwhile, Detective Mark Sullivan sped through the night in his cruiser, his mind fixated on the details of the case that was unfolding. A seasoned veteran in handling domestic crises, his thoughts were a steady stream of analysis and experience. He knew too well that every second counted, that the fine line between rescue and catastrophe could vanish in an instant. As he navigated the winding streets, his focus was absolute, a determination to restore order amid the chaos. Back inside the apartment, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Emma, with her voice quivering and barely above a whisper, repeated her plea into the receiver, "Please help." The operator's words, calm and measured, offered a glimmer of solace against the backdrop of violence, but the fragile hope was soon overshadowed by the relentless roar of David's anger. His pacing became more frantic as the red and blue hues from the police vehicles seeped through the windows, casting eerie shadows that seemed to animate his inner demons. David muttered bitter curses under his breath, the words tumbling out in a mix of defiance and despair. "I won't be controlled by anyone," he snarled, his voice laced with the tremor of panic. Each passing second deepened his sense of entrapment, as if the world around him was closing in from every side. His eyes, dark with a storm of emotions, flickered between rage and a growing fear, a fear that the impending arrival of the police might strip him of even the semblance of power he clung to so desperately. Outside the building, as the cacophony of approaching officers filled the night, Detective Sullivan's voice rang out with quiet authority. "We need to secure the area and enter with caution," he instructed, each word deliberate and laden with the gravity of the situation. His team moved with practiced precision, their steps measured as they closed in on the source of the crisis. The distant echoes of the operator's reassurances mingled with the tense rhythm of hurried commands. In that charged moment, the apartment teetered on the brink of an irreversible shift, a fine balance between imminent rescue and further devastation. The echoes of fear reverberated through every room, each heartbeat a reminder of the fragile line between innocence and the abyss. As David's frenzied mutterings mingled with the persistent sound of sirens, the fate of those trapped within was now poised on the edge of a precipice, each moment dragging them closer to an uncertain destiny. The atmosphere inside the apartment was now a volatile mixture of desperation and mounting panic. In the dimly lit corridor outside the Carter residence, Mary Thompson's determined knock reverberated sharply, punctuating the night with an urgent plea for intervention. Inside, the knock startled David momentarily, drawing his bloodshot eyes to the door. For a brief instant, the intrusion offered a distraction, a potential escape from the overwhelming pressure he felt. Yet that hope was as fleeting as it was dangerous. At the same time, Paul Rivera's steady voice continued to relay his observations to the operator, confirming that the situation was spiraling out of control. "I can hear them now. There's a struggle inside," he reported, his tone resolute and unwavering. Every word he uttered painted a vivid picture of a household in crisis, a place where the veneer of normalcy had long since been stripped away, revealing raw, unhealed wounds. Inside, the tension reached a boiling point. The flashing lights from the police cars outside cast erratic, dancing patterns across the room. David's panic deepened as he realized that the grip he had on the situation was slipping away. In a moment of frantic desperation, he seized young Emma, drawing her close as if her presence alone could restore some semblance of control. "Stay with me," he commanded in a voice that was both protective and possessive, his words a jumbled mixture of love and fear. Emma's small body shuddered in his arms as she clutched the fabric of his shirt, her wide eyes reflecting a terror too profound for her tender years. Rachel, paralyzed by shock and pain, could only watch as her daughter was ensnared by the man she once loved. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing her silent plea for an end to the nightmare. The room vibrated with the discordant sounds of desperate commands, muffled cries, and the ever-approaching rumble of sirens, a symphony of chaos that foretold further calamity. Outside, Detective Mark Sullivan's team gathered at the entrance, their weapons drawn and senses sharpened by years of experience. Sullivan himself peered through the narrow window of the door, taking in the grim scene with a practiced eye. The interior of the apartment was a tableau of disarray, splintered furniture, scattered personal belongings, and an aura of despair that permeated every corner. With measured urgency, he ordered, "Secure the perimeter. We enter on my mark. Everyone be on high alert." His tone brooked no argument. Every second now was critical. As the officers formed a cautious line at the threshold, the sounds inside reached a crescendo. The clamor of David's desperate mutterings, the muffled sobs of Rachel, and the persistent, frightened pleas of Emma melded into a dissonant chorus that underscored the peril of the moment. Then, with a sudden force that shattered the mounting tension, a loud and ominous noise erupted. A door swung open with a force that cut through the chaos like a knife. In that split second, the fragile balance was irrevocably altered. David, clutching Emma tightly as though her very life depended on it, surged forward into the uncertain corridor. The abrupt sound of the door opening served as a harbinger of what was to come, a final desperate bid to escape the crushing inevitability of intervention. Detective Sullivan's eyes widened as he registered the movement, the sight of father and daughter vanishing into the shadows, sending a jolt of alarm through his team. For an agonizing moment, the apartment fell into a stunned silence, punctuated only by the fading echo of that decisive door swing. The figures of David and Emma disappeared from view, swallowed by the darkness of the hallway. The scene, suspended in a heartbeat of uncertainty, left everyone present teetering on the brink of irreversible change. In that charged pause, the sound of the door closing signaled not a conclusion, but the promise of a new, even more perilous chapter. Every heart in that moment beat in unison with the silent understanding that the stakes had just been raised. The lives of those involved now hung by the thinnest of threads. Suspended between desperate hope and impending catastrophe, the future of that fraught night lay shrouded in uncertainty as the echo of that door opening reverberated in the minds of all who had witnessed it, a final chilling note in the symphony of fear that had overtaken the once quiet apartment. The night was far from over, and as the darkness reclaimed the corridor, the promise of further terror loomed ominously in the silence left behind. The sound of shattering glass and desperate cries still echoed in the dim corridors of the apartment building when the police finally forced their way inside. Officers surged into the living room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and revealing a scene of chaos. Amid the disarray, scattered belongings, overturned furniture, and evidence of the violent struggle, lay Rachel Carter. Though clearly wounded, she clung to life, her eyes wide with terror and sorrow. In a broken, trembling voice, she cried out, "David took Emma!" The words rang out like a final plea for salvation, each syllable weighted with the anguish of a woman who had endured too much. Detective Mark Sullivan, a man whose years on the force had honed both his instincts and his resolve, quickly took charge. His calm, authoritative tone cut through the clamor as he barked, "Secure the area! Check every room!" His eyes, steeled by experience, swept over the battered interior, noting every detail that might reveal the whereabouts of the fugitive father and his terrified daughter. Outside, in the cool night air, the once quiet alley behind the building now hummed with urgency. Amid the scattered debris of the evening's turmoil, David Carter staggered into view. His face, contorted with a mix of panic and determination, betrayed his inner turmoil. With adrenaline surging through his veins, he moved swiftly toward the back of the building, where the dim light revealed an unlocked car, likely left ajar by a neighbor who had long forgotten to secure it. David's hands trembled as he fumbled with the door, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting the sound of approaching sirens to catch him at any moment. He slid into the driver's seat and with a rough tug started the engine. The car roared to life, its sound echoing off the brick walls of the alley. In the back seat, Emma, no longer the silent observer of the horror that had unfolded, burst into muffled cries. Her small frame shook with terror, and she clutched the seat tightly as if it were a lifeline. "Daddy, please stop!" she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the din of the revving engine. Inside the apartment, the officers exchanged grim looks as they pieced together the unfolding drama. Rachel's desperate shout had set a chain of events into motion, and now the realization that David had fled with his daughter spurred immediate action. Detective Sullivan raced to the door and, catching sight of the flashing lights outside, knew that every second mattered. "He's on the move," he ordered, his voice steady yet urgent. "Secure the perimeter and prepare for a pursuit. We can't let them get away." The moment the car pulled away from the building, the night seemed to erupt into a frenzy of motion and sound. Sirens wailed in the distance as additional police vehicles converged on the scene. The pavement blurred beneath the speeding car as David accelerated through the deserted streets, his erratic driving a stark reflection of the tumult within his mind. The dash camera in one of the police cruisers captured every moment, every twist and turn, every burst of acceleration as the fugitive car veered dangerously close to the highway. Detective Sullivan, now at the helm of the unfolding chase, communicated swiftly into his radio, his words clipped and direct. "The car is on the highway! He's accelerating!" His voice, calm yet imbued with urgency, reverberated through the channel as the pursuit gained momentum. The camera's lens offered a frantic, unyielding view of the speeding vehicle disappearing into the darkness, its taillights a fleeting beacon in the night. As the distance between the fleeing car and the pursuing police narrowed, the tension mounted with every heartbeat. The driver's erratic maneuvers were met with determined countermeasures. Every officer on the scene was committed to bringing the desperate chase to an end before another life was jeopardized. In the confines of the police cruiser, Detective Sullivan's focus was absolute. His mind raced with calculations, predicting each twist of the road, every potential hazard that might endanger not just the fugitives, but innocent bystanders as well. Back in the car, David's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. Every flash of red and blue in the rearview mirror reminded him that time was slipping away. His eyes flickered between the road and the small figure in the back seat, whose cries grew louder with each passing second. "Hold on, Emma," he muttered, his voice a rough mixture of desperation and an almost imperceptible tenderness. Despite the chaos of his actions, there was a fleeting moment, a pause in the storm, where the love for his daughter warred with the terror of capture. But that moment was quickly swallowed by the relentless pursuit of fate. The highway stretched out before them, a ribbon of asphalt fraught with danger. The car's tires screeched as David attempted to navigate the bends at breakneck speeds. The intensity of the chase was palpable, the air thick with the promise of imminent confrontation. Every turn, every burst of acceleration added layers of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. The distant sounds of police sirens melded with the roar of the engine, creating a dissonant symphony that echoed the fractured state of the man behind the wheel. For a fleeting instant, time seemed to suspend itself, the frantic pulse of the chase slowing to a heartbeat, a momentary pause where the outcome hung in delicate balance. Yet, as the speeding car merged onto the highway, the tension surged anew. The flashing lights in the rearview mirror grew more insistent, and Detective Sullivan's orders rang out clear and uncompromising. "Keep the pursuit tight. Do not let them lose momentum." The dash camera continued to capture every harrowing detail. The blurring landscape, the frantic shifts in the vehicle's trajectory, and the unwavering determination of the officers in pursuit. In that split second, as the car became a mere shadow racing through the night, the promise of what was to come loomed ominously, a fate that would soon challenge the limits of human endurance and resolve. As the gap between the fleeing car and the police cruiser diminished, the intensity of the pursuit reached its zenith. Every second counted. Every decision made on that dark highway would have profound consequences. And in the heart of that speeding vehicle, the fragile hope that had been kindled by a desperate act of innocence now clashed with the harsh reality of a life on the run. The scene was set for an inevitable collision of fate as the forces of law and chaos converged on a path that led only to the unknown. The highway at night, illuminated only by the harsh glare of streetlights and the intermittent flash of police vehicles, became the stage for a relentless pursuit that threatened to spiral out of control. David's car, driven with the erratic precision of a man teetering on the edge, darted across lanes with a desperation born of fear. Every twist of the wheel, every sudden swerve betrayed the mounting panic within him. In the back seat, Emma's cries grew louder, a mix of terror and pleading that pierced through the cacophony of the speeding chase. Inside the police cruiser, Detective Sullivan's eyes remained fixed on the dash camera feed. The vehicle ahead was a blur of red taillights and shifting shadows. "Maintain your distance," he commanded into the radio, his voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of concern. "We can't let him lose control." His words echoed in the confined space of the cruiser as he surveyed the rapidly changing landscape outside the window, every second a precarious balance between order and chaos. The highway itself was unforgiving, a long, dark ribbon lined with potential hazards. The pursuit had taken them onto an open stretch where the speedometer in David's car threatened to climb ever higher. The relentless hum of the engine, the screeching of tires, and the persistent wail of sirens combined to create a symphony of impending disaster. In that moment, the entire world was reduced to the narrow confines of the road, the car, and the desperate flight from an inescapable fate. David's focus was split between the road and the small, terrified figure behind him. "Hold on, Emma," he murmured, his voice a fragile thread of reassurance amid the roaring chaos. Emma's response was a sob, punctuated by the occasional plea, "Daddy, please stop." The emotional weight of her words seemed to intensify the pressure on David's already fragile mind. Every moment, every decision was a razor's edge between a semblance of control and the abyss of total collapse. As the chase roared on, the landscape outside blurred into a montage of fleeting images. The neon glare of distant billboards, the stark outlines of trees and overpasses, and the endless expanse of the highway stretching into the night. The pursuing police vehicles maintained a steady formation, their headlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of impending retribution. Detective Sullivan's mind raced with scenarios. The possibility of a sudden maneuver, the risk of collateral damage, and the ever-present danger that the speeding car might soon reach a critical breaking point. Then, in a heartbeat that felt stretched to infinity, the inevitable happened. A sudden violent jolt rocked David's car, a moment when the unyielding force of gravity and speed collided with the limits of physics. The tires screeched in protest as the car lost traction on a slick patch of asphalt. In an instant, the vehicle veered wildly, careening out of its designated lane. The sound of metal twisting and shattering filled the air as the car slammed into the guardrail, the impact reverberating like a death knell. Inside the car, time fractured into a series of disjointed seconds. Emma's terrified scream mingled with the roar of the engine as the car capsized violently, tumbling onto its roof. David fought desperately to regain control, his hands grasping at the steering wheel as if trying to hold on to the remnants of his shattered fate. The world outside spun in a blur of dark shapes and flashing lights as the car skidded along the edge of the highway, its momentum carrying it further from the path of safety. In the midst of the chaos, the sounds of the pursuit receded into a distant, haunting echo. The once frantic sirens now seemed to form a solemn backdrop to the unfolding catastrophe. Through the shattered windshield, Detective Sullivan could see the overturned car, its frame contorted by the violent impact. In that moment, he knew that the chase had reached a turning point, a point where the desperate flight of a tormented man was about to collide with the brutal reality of consequence. The dash camera continued its relentless recording as the vehicle, now a twisted wreck, slid off the highway. Flames began to lick at the edges of the crumpled metal, a slow and ominous prelude to the impending inferno. David's face, streaked with sweat and a mixture of fear and resolve, was barely visible through the distorted glass. His eyes darted wildly, searching for a way out, for any glimmer of hope amid the unfolding disaster. The sound of crumpling metal, the hiss of escaping air, and the distant murmur of police voices combined to create a cacophony that underscored the tragic inevitability of the situation. As the vehicle finally came to an abrupt halt, its tires smoking on the verge of total disintegration, Emma's cries subsided into quiet whimpers. The overturned car, now shrouded in a growing cloud of smoke, seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for the final, irrevocable moment. Detective Sullivan's voice, steady but laden with urgency, cut through the haze. "Secure the area. We need to get them out before it's too late." His command was met with swift action as officers moved closer, their silhouettes emerging through the billowing smoke. In that precarious pause between disaster and rescue, the fate of David and Emma hung in a delicate balance. The crash was not just a collision of metal and speed, it was a shattering moment where the past, present, and future collided in a burst of violence and regret. The highway, once a symbol of escape, had become a crucible, where choices were burned into memory with searing intensity. And as the fire began to spread, licking at the edges of the wreckage and threatening to consume everything in its path, the scene faded into a disquieting silence. A silence that spoke volumes of the cost of desperation, the fragility of hope, and the inexorable march toward an uncertain end. The night was ablaze with chaos and searing heat. The overturned car, now a twisted monument to desperation, lay at the edge of a deserted highway as flames licked its mangled surface. In the midst of the smoldering wreckage, David Carter emerged like a wounded animal from a trap. His face was streaked with soot and blood, each labored step testament to a man pushed beyond the limits of pain and remorse. The acrid smell of burning rubber and metal mingled with the bitter tang of his own fear. Every movement was an agonizing reminder of choices made and chances lost. Inside the crumpled vehicle, Emma's muffled cries echoed against the roar of the encroaching fire. Her small form, confined by the unyielding clasp of a seatbelt, trembled in silent terror. David's heart pounded as he beheld the fragile life trapped behind shattered glass. The sight of her wide, tear-filled eyes reignited a spark buried deep within. A desperate, yearning need for redemption that fought against the chaos of his own making. He staggered toward the car's rear door, his hands shaking as they fumbled with the latch. The heat was nearly unbearable, and every second that passed brought the flames closer, threatening to engulf them both. "Hold on, Emma," he murmured, his voice a ragged whisper amid the cacophony of cracking metal and hissing fire. His words carried the weight of every regret and every moment of lost time. Even as the searing heat scorched his skin, his determination to save the one person who still shone with innocence overpowered his instinct to flee. With painstaking slowness, David managed to unfasten the seatbelt. The mechanism protested with a final reluctant click, a sound that cut through the roar of the blaze like a fragile promise. Emma's eyes met his, and in that brief exchange, the agony of the past mingled with the fragile hope of a second chance. "Daddy, please," she whimpered, her voice trembling as much from terror as from the desperate need for rescue. For a long moment, David hesitated at the threshold of the wreck, caught in the throes of an internal battle. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, to save himself from the inferno that threatened to swallow him whole, but the memory of Emma's pleading gaze tethered him to the task at hand. In that heartbeat of indecision, the flames roared louder, their tongues lapping hungrily at the doorframe, as if urging him to act before it was too late. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his battered body, David scooped Emma into his arms. The weight of her small body grounded him, reminding him that despite the chaos, love could still offer a path out of darkness. He staggered away from the burning car, each step a struggle against both gravity and the searing heat. The world around him was a blur of orange infernos and smoky shadows, punctuated by the occasional roar of collapsing metal and distant shouts from the arriving emergency responders. As they moved away from the wreckage, a sudden violent explosion shattered the fragile calm. The car erupted in a burst of flame and shrapnel, sending a shockwave rippling through the air. David's ears rang with the deafening sound, and the force of the blast knocked him off his feet for an agonizing second. In that split moment, the world seemed to slow down, every detail etched into his memory. The way Emma's tiny body trembled against his chest, the sound of her frightened cry, and the blinding flash of the explosion that painted the night with horror. "Emma!" he cried out, his voice raw with panic, as he scrambled to regain his footing. The force of the explosion had dislodged debris from the wreck, and shards of twisted metal rained down around him. He shielded Emma with his body, instinctively positioning her between him and the onslaught. The roar of the flames, the crackle of burning fabric, and the distant, urgent commands of the first responders filled the air as he pushed forward with a determination born of pure instinct. Every step was a battle. His legs, already weakened by the strain of the chase and the ensuing crash, now wobbled as he fought against the searing heat that threatened to sap his remaining strength. The night was punctuated by flashes of orange light from the flames and the desperate beams of police searchlights that sketched frantic patterns on the ground. In the distance, the sound of sirens mingled with the low hum of engines and the urgent shouts of firefighters, forming a dissonant chorus that underscored the dire stakes of his actions. David's mind raced with conflicting thoughts, the terror of the explosion, the agony of his body, and the unyielding drive to save Emma collided in a maelstrom of emotion. Memories of every harsh word and every moment of regret surged forward as he forced himself onward. Each footfall was a penance, a desperate attempt to atone for the years of torment and the irreversible decisions that had brought them to this moment. "I have to get you out," he repeated like a mantra, his voice ragged but resolute. The heat was almost unbearable now, the flames seeming to chase them as they neared the relative safety of the roadside. Every instinct told him to push on, to ignore the searing pain in his limbs, and to focus solely on the survival of his daughter. Emma, cradled in his arms, clung to him as if he were her last hope. Her eyes, wide with terror, occasionally met his, and in those fleeting moments a silent promise passed between them, a promise that, no matter how dark the night, there was still a chance for redemption. At last, they reached a stretch of asphalt partially shielded from the full fury of the blaze. David collapsed onto the cool, hard ground, his body shaking uncontrollably as he tried to catch his breath. The acrid smoke stung his eyes, and he could barely see the approaching figures of firefighters and paramedics who hurried toward them with practiced urgency. "Hold on, Emma," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers, the sound of her shallow breaths, both a comfort and a reminder of what was at stake. In the chaos of that moment, the external world receded, leaving only the fragile bond between father and daughter. The sounds of emergency vehicles, the hum of distant voices, and the persistent crackle of flames became a distant backdrop to their shared struggle for survival. David's thoughts drifted between regret and a desperate determination to salvage something, however small, from the wreckage of his life. In that crucible of pain and fire, the final act of his existence was unfolding, a moment where redemption and ruin collided in a blaze of raw emotion. As paramedics reached them and began to assess the situation, David's vision blurred with tears and smoke. He could feel the weight of his past sins pressing down on him, yet in that moment, there was only the burning need to protect Emma. "I'm here, baby," he murmured softly as a medic gently took over, lifting Emma from his arms to a stretcher. His own body trembled not only from pain, but from the realization that the path to redemption was paved with sacrifice. With one final, desperate look at the inferno behind him, he allowed the professionals to take over, his own fate now suspended in the uncertain hands of time. The scene that night was etched in the minds of all who witnessed it, a testament to the fragility of life, the power of redemption, and the crushing consequences of choices made in the grip of despair. David's final act, born out of a desperate love for his daughter, would forever be remembered as both an act of courage and a tragic culmination of a life lived on the edge. In the sterile corridors of a sprawling hospital, the relentless beeping of monitors and the soft hum of ventilation systems underscored the fragile balance between life and death. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the pale walls, revealing the raw edges of a reality that was both clinical and profoundly human. Rachel Carter hurried down the corridor, her heart a tumult of fear and hope. Each step was heavy with uncertainty, every breath a silent prayer for her daughter's survival. The night had been long and tormenting, and now the waiting was a torture in itself. At the nurse's station, a flurry of hushed voices and urgent gestures confirmed what Rachel had been dreading. Emma was in room 307, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by the soft beeps of life-saving equipment. The room was dimly lit, the gentle hum of the machine a constant reminder that each second was precious. Rachel's vision blurred with tears as she approached the door, her heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. She could almost feel the weight of every past moment, the abuse, the fear, the desperate nights, and now it was all converging in this one sterile space. Inside room 307, Emma lay wrapped in a cocoon of blankets, her small face pale but marked by an unmistakable spark of resilience. A nurse adjusted the IV line with a practiced hand while speaking in soft, soothing tones, as if every word could coax life back into the fragile form before her. "She's a strong little girl," the nurse said, her voice gentle yet filled with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had seen too much sorrow and too little hope. The words, meant to console, brought a bittersweet relief to Rachel, who had been clutching onto the fragile hope of a miracle. Down the hall, in a quiet corner of the intensive care unit, Detective Mark Sullivan stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on a set of medical charts that detailed the aftermath of that fateful night. The report was a stark account of David Carter's injuries, a litany of broken bones, deep lacerations, and a heart struggling under the relentless assault of trauma. Even more damning was the revelation of his long-neglected bipolar disorder, a truth that had haunted the case from the start. Sullivan's face, etched with years of witnessing the worst of human frailty, betrayed a deep, unspoken sorrow. In that moment, he understood that the tragedy was not merely the result of one man's failure, but the culmination of a system that had long allowed pain to fester unchecked. Rachel's steps faltered as she reached the door to the intensive care unit. There, in a bed bathed in the sterile glow of medical monitors, lay David Carter. The sight was a brutal collision of past and present. The man who had once been a force of uncontrolled anger now appeared as a fragile, broken shell, his eyes closed in an eternal struggle against his failing body. The room was filled with the quiet whir of machines, a sound that punctuated the sorrowful silence. Detective Sullivan's measured voice broke through Rachel's reverie. "We've done all we can for him, Rachel," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with a look that conveyed both sympathy and inevitability. "His heart is failing. He's not long for this world." Rachel's voice trembled as she tried to reconcile the man before her with the monster of her memories. "Why couldn't he have let her go?" she whispered, her words carrying a mingled cocktail of pain, anger, and bewildered pity. The question hung in the air, unanswered and heavy with the burden of years lost to violence. In that moment, as the steady beep of the monitor marked the cadence of impending finality, the weight of regret pressed down on her, blurring the lines between hatred and reluctant forgiveness. In the quiet intimacy of that ICU room, David's eyes flickered open. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it sent a jolt of raw emotion through Rachel's heart. His gaze, haunted and full of sorrow, locked with hers, a silent plea for absolution. "I never meant to hurt her," he croaked, his voice barely rising above the hum of the machines. The confession, whispered in a moment of fragile clarity, reverberated in the silence, leaving behind an echo of remorse that was as painful as it was futile. The finality of his words was matched only by the slow, inevitable faltering of the monitor's steady beep. Outside, the corridors of the hospital carried the soft footsteps of medical staff and the hushed murmurs of families clinging to hope. Detective Sullivan lingered, his presence a somber reminder of the cost of human frailty. He'd seen too many lives unraveled by the interplay of circumstance and personal demons, and tonight was no exception. As he stepped away from the ICU, his mind was a tangle of memories and reflections, each one underscoring the bitter truth that not every life could be salvaged, no matter how noble the intentions behind the desperate acts of redemption. Rachel remained by Emma's bedside long into the night. her presence a silent vow that she would fight to rebuild what had been shattered. The soft murmur of Emma's breathing and the occasional rustle of hospital linens became a gentle rhythm of survival, a lullaby of hope amidst the sorrow. When Emma's eyes finally fluttered open, meeting her mother's with a tentative smile, Rachel felt a small measure of relief. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, the words imbued with a resolve that was slowly taking shape even as the night wore on. In that quiet space, where life and death waged a constant, subtle battle, the past began to recede into a painful background. The raw emotions of the night, anger, regret, sorrow, and a glimmer of hope, wove themselves into a tapestry of tentative healing. Rachel, though still haunted by the memories of David's transgressions, found within herself a burgeoning strength, a determination to forge a future for Emma that would be free of the shadows of their past. As the hospital slowly drifted into a fragile calm, the awakening of a new day promised that there was still time to mend, to heal, and to rebuild. The scars of that tumultuous night would remain, etched into the hearts of those who had survived, but they would also serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a spirit that, even in the face of overwhelming darkness, could find the courage to reach for the light. A gray morning broke over the city, heavy with the promise of rain yet to fall. The cemetery, quiet and somber under a sky weighed down by clouds, became the setting for a final farewell that was both a reckoning and a beginning. David Carter's funeral was a modest affair, attended by a scattering of neighbors, distant relatives, and a few souls who remembered him not solely as the tormentor of a troubled family, but as a man undone by his inner battles. A man who, in his final moments, had shown a desperate flicker of redemption. Rachel stood apart from the small gathering, her eyes fixed on the simple wooden casket that contained the remains of a man whose life had been as turbulent as it was tragic. The air was cool and still, each breath mingling with the muted sound of soft weeping and whispered condolences. As the officiant spoke in measured tones, Rachel's thoughts wandered through the labyrinth of memories that had defined the years of abuse, and the desperate hope that had, for a fleeting moment, shimmered in the darkness. Every word of the service seemed to echo the complexity of a life lived on the edge, of a man who had both inflicted deep wounds and, in the twilight of his existence, reached out in a final trembling bid for forgiveness. After the service, the mourners slowly dispersed, leaving Rachel and Emma alone amid the quiet rows of gravestones. The cemetery, with its weathered markers and silent testimonies to lives past, became a sanctuary of reflection. Emma, holding her mother's hand, looked up at her with eyes too wise for her tender age. "Mommy, he saved me in the end, didn't he?" she asked softly, the question hanging in the cool air like a fragile promise of understanding. Rachel's heart tightened at the innocence of the inquiry, a stark reminder that even in the midst of profound sorrow, the simple truths of love and sacrifice could not be obscured by the complexities of adult pain. Kneeling beside Emma, Rachel embraced her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied, her voice steady despite the tumult within. "He did what he could in his final moments, but it's up to us now to make sure that we build something better out of all of this." Her words, though tinged with sorrow, carried a resolute determination, a vow that the cycle of violence and despair would not define their future. In the weeks and months that followed, the days began to hold the promise of healing. The small apartment, once a prison of fear and sorrow, slowly transformed into a place of tentative renewal. Rachel, determined to reclaim her life, immersed herself in the quiet work of rebuilding, a process that involved therapy sessions, community support groups, and long reflective walks through the city's parks. With each day that passed, the sharp edges of her memories softened, replaced by a gentle hope that even after the darkest storm, the sun would rise once more. Emma, too, began to find solace in the world beyond the walls of their former prison. In a nearby park, the laughter of children and the rustle of newly sprouted leaves became the backdrop for her gradual return to innocence. Rachel watched from a distance as Emma ran freely across the green expanse, her tentative smile a small but undeniable beacon of resilience. The park, vibrant with life and quiet promise, became a sacred space, a living reminder that even after the fiercest rain, renewal was possible. Slowly, the shattered fragments of their past began to coalesce into a mosaic of lessons learned and a future to be reclaimed. Rachel found herself sharing her story with others in support groups, her words a blend of raw honesty and hard-won wisdom. In these conversations, she discovered that healing was not about forgetting the pain, but about forging a path forward with the scars as reminders of what must never be repeated. The pain of the past remained, but it no longer held dominion over her future. As the seasons changed, so too did the contours of their lives. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Rachel and Emma returned to the cemetery, not to dwell on what was lost, but to honor the memory of a man whose life had been as conflicted as it was tragic. Standing before David Carter's grave, Rachel placed a single flower on the worn stone. "We will remember you," she whispered, her voice a blend of sorrow and resolve. "But we will also choose to move forward, to build a life of love and peace for Emma." Her words, carried away on the gentle autumn breeze, marked a quiet yet profound turning point. A moment when the past was acknowledged, but the future was reclaimed. And so, as the rain finally began to fall, soft, cleansing drops that washed away the remnants of grief, the world seemed to promise a new day. In the embrace of that gentle rain, Rachel and Emma stepped forward into a future that, while scarred by the memories of yesterday, held the potential for renewal. The park, the community, and the quiet strength that resided within each of them offered a path away from the darkness, one tender step at a time. In that delicate balance between remembrance and hope, after the long, relentless storm, they discovered that even the deepest wounds could heal. Each day became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a promise that after the rain, there would always come a sunrise, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning.